You have done the hard work of looking inward, and you can name the pattern, trace it back to its source, and explain it all out loud. Then someone goes quiet in a text thread, or your idea gets passed over in a meeting, and your whole system fires exactly like it did years ago. This is not a failure of your awareness, but it is something else entirely, and you need to understand precisely why it happens. Nobody in this space says the following clearly enough, so we need to start right here. Knowing why you get triggered and actually not getting triggered are two completely different biological events that do not live in the same part of your brain. These processes do not run on the same timeline, and mixing them up is the source of most of the shame that self-aware people carry around. One process happens in the cortex where your language lives, which is where you build a narrative and connect a present irritation to something from a long time ago. The other happens in the subcortex, and it moves faster than language or any conscious thought because it lives in the part of your nervous system that learned what danger looks like before you even had words for it. When you are sitting there with a tight chest and running the scenario for the fourth time, you might tell yourself that you know this is just an old abandonment pattern. You tell yourself this person isn't actually rejecting you, but the tightness stays there anyway, because these are just two systems operating at two different speeds. The slower system happens to be the one doing the narrating, while the faster one is already reacting to the perceived threat. Memory research makes a distinction between what we call explicit and implicit memory. Explicit memory is the story you can tell, the insight you can put into words, and the timeline you can construct to hand over to a therapist. Implicit memory is different because it is the body's record of what happened, and it is encoded as a sensory signature rather than a story. This works more like an alarm setting than a file you can open, and that alarm never checks in with your narrative before it decides to fire. Your awareness lives in the explicit system, but your trigger lives in the implicit one, and the implicit system is faster every single time. This is what it means when recognition outruns regulation. You can recognize a pattern in real time and even narrate it as it happens, but you will still be stuck inside the physiological response before that recognition does anything useful. The awareness arrives after the alarm has already tripped, which means you are already flooded by the time the understanding walks through the door. The problem is not that you lack insight, but rather that insight and regulation are not the same process and do not even share the same mechanism. Because nobody made that distinction clearly for you, every time the trigger fires anyway, you do something predictable and damaging. You take that awareness and turn it into a verdict, deciding that because the insight didn't work, something must be fundamentally broken. You end up adding shame on top of an activation that is already running. And now you are trying to manage two fires instead of one. That is the actual trap. And it is a shame loop that only self-aware people can run, because it requires enough vocabulary to prosecute yourself. Most of the advice you see about triggers has a hidden goal, which is to turn you into someone who just doesn't have them anymore. You've seen the videos about emotional impermeability and the stoic adjacent framing that promises you can transcend reactivity entirely if you just try hard enough. That way of thinking is actually doing real damage because it completely misidentifies what a trigger is in the first place. A trigger isn't a malfunction of your brain, but rather a detection of your environment. Your nervous system spent years building a massive library of patterns, and most of that construction happened long before you had the mental capacity to understand what was going on. Maybe it was a specific tone of voice that always came right before something bad happened, or a heavy silence that meant you were in trouble, or a certain look of dismissal that meant you were about to be left out. Your system catalogued every single one of those moments, not as memories you can sit down and look at, but as operational code that tells your body to mobilize the second it detects that specific shape. When a trigger fires today, your system is doing exactly what it was designed to do for your survival. Something in your current world matched the shape of an old threat closely enough that the alarm went off. And that match doesn't even have to be literal. It just needs to carry the same frequency or structure as the original pain. The School of Life describes this as a mechanism where a triggering element fits into a puzzle from your past, meaning you are triggered now by the very things that devastated you back then. The precision of that match is actually proof that your pattern detection system is working perfectly, which is a very different perspective than assuming you are broken. This realization changes the entire conversation from, "Why am I still reacting like this?" to a much more useful question about what your system just detected. You can start asking what pattern it recognized and what the shape of that activation tells you about when that code was first written. This whole video is built on that specific reframe, because a trigger is essentially a GPS coordinate on the unconscious map. It points to a specific spot in your history that was encoded before you even had the language to describe it. The detection already happened, and you can't undo it, but you can learn to read where it's pointing instead of just feeling the shame and letting the loop run again. That is the real difference between a trigger that controls you and one you can actually work with in your daily life. It isn't about suppression or becoming some kind of unfeeling statue, but rather about the ability to see the signal for what it is. It's just information about an old pattern, not a final verdict on who you are as a person right now. The map is already there in front of you, and the only real question is whether you're willing to look at it. There is a second mechanism running underneath your triggers that self-aware people are especially vulnerable to because it hides inside the language of personal growth. You can be doing the work and reading the books and still completely miss this one, mostly because it feels like a genuine insight while it's happening. Carl Jung called this projection, and while the theory is simple, the reality is much harder to face. When there is something in your own psychology that you haven't integrated because it doesn't fit the version of yourself you want to be, your mind doesn't just delete it. It relocates that quality onto other people and then responds to it there with a level of intensity that feels completely justified. This gets very specific for people who are focused on inner work and self-improvement. The more you try to hold on to a rigid identity, the more aggressively your mind will project the parts of you that don't fit that image. If you have built your entire life around being calm and measured, a person who is loud and volatile won't just be annoying, but will actually become intolerable in a way that doesn't make sense. If you pride yourself on being generous and selfless, someone who is openly looking out for themselves won't just seem different, but will trigger a sense of moral outrage that is actually a form of recognition. Kathleen Adams has written about how we often love or hate qualities in others as a way of dealing with those same qualities in ourselves. The projection works like a cut and paste command, where the material is removed from your internal document and placed onto someone else. But the data is still sitting in your buffer. It never actually left your system. It just found a new place to land. This explains why certain people can get under your skin in a way that feels deeply personal, even if you barely know them. It's why one specific flavor of behavior can activate something in you that feels totally out of proportion to what is actually happening in the room. That intensity is the signal you need to pay attention to, and it isn't telling you how bad the other person is. It's a signal about how much unprocessed material is sitting right behind your own reaction. The self-aware version of this is very subtle, because it usually shows up as a brilliant, articulate critique of someone else's flaws. You can describe their patterns and where they come from with perfect accuracy. And while your analysis might be right, the emotional charge underneath it belongs to you. That charge is the tell, and it matters much more than the content of your critique. Before we trace the chain, notice the theme. Your reactions become clearer when you can see what repeats. This video is sponsored by Senda, the AI journal that shows you the patterns and blind spots shaping your life. Write or dictate what happened, deepen the entry, and Senda helps surface patterns across entries over time. Try it free for 7 days through the link in the description. Now let's trace the chain. When a trigger fires, it never happens in isolation. It runs a chain that moves much faster than you can track in real time, which is why it always feels like you went from being totally fine to completely activated, with nothing in between. There was actually a lot happening in between, but you just couldn't see it at that speed. Here is how that structure works. Something in your environment carries the shape of an old pattern, and your system detects that match before you even consciously register that anything is wrong. A physiological response kicks in immediately. Your heart rate shifts, your muscles tighten, and your attention narrows down onto the perceived threat. Then your mind finally catches up and generates a narrative to explain what your body just did. That narrative pulls from your existing beliefs about yourself and other people, and those beliefs are what shape what happens next. By the time you are even aware that you are activated, you are already at step 4 or 5 of the process. The detection happened way back at step 1, and your body responded at step 2, but you didn't catch any of it until the very end. Now you are trying to use insight to manage something that is already 3 steps downstream from where it actually started. CBT identifies these as automatic thoughts, which are the rapid interpretations your mind generates to explain why your body feels this way. But the automatic thought is not the beginning of the chain. It is just the mind's attempt to make sense of something the body already decided. You feel the tightening in your chest, and your mind goes looking for a reason, and it always finds one. Because ambiguous signals are very easy to interpret when you already have a well-worn template. The interpretation your mind reaches is almost always consistent with your deepest existing pattern. If your core operating belief is that your presence is provisional and you have to earn continued interest, then a slow text response becomes immediate evidence. The chain runs without you, starting with the delayed response, moving to threat detection and physiological activation, and ending with a narrative already forming. You tell yourself they are pulling back, and it is happening again. And while that narrative feels like analysis, it is actually just pattern completion. Your mind is finishing a sentence it has finished hundreds of times before, and it does it faster than you could interrupt, even if you tried. This is what makes the insight loop so exhausting, in a way that plain anxiety isn't. You are aware enough to watch the chain run. You can see the interpretation forming, and you can even name it while it is happening. The chain keeps running anyway, because naming the pattern doesn't interrupt it at step 1, it just adds a commentary track to steps 4 and 5, while everything upstream continues exactly as it did before. What actually interrupts the chain isn't a thought, it is a structure, something that routes the signal differently before the narrative has already closed around it. So what does it actually look like to use a trigger as a coordinate instead of a verdict? It starts with a shift in your orientation that is small in description, but very significant in practice. When the activation happens, instead of moving immediately toward what this means about you or how to make it stop, you move toward asking what your system just detected. You don't do this in the moment of peak activation because that window is already closed. A nervous system under acute stress does not have the bandwidth for this kind of precise inquiry, and trying to force it usually just generates more narrative. The useful window opens in the aftermath, when the charge has dropped enough for you to think, but the memory of what happened is still fresh and specific. In that window, the question you need to ask is structural. What was the exact signal that tripped the response? You aren't looking for the general situation, you want the specific element inside it. Was it a certain tone of voice, a particular kind of silence, or the moment someone's attention moved elsewhere when you needed to matter? It might even be a compliment with a qualifier buried inside it. This precision matters because precision is what separates information from noise, and while vague answers produce more rumination, specific answers produce coordinates. There is a useful example in the trigger literature about a person activated by images of attractive, popular people on social media. The obvious interpretation is that beauty is the trigger, but the actual signal is more specific than that. It is the structure of being passed over and watching others get chosen while you don't, because that was the real historical event. Beauty was just the packaging for the signal. Once that distinction is clear, the activation points somewhere accurate instead of somewhere general, and you can work with it differently. That level of specificity is the coordinate. The more precisely you can name what tripped the response, the more accurately you can locate what it is actually pointing toward. The second move is looking at the narrative your mind produced and asking what belief that narrative required to exist. If the chain ran, "They didn't respond," therefore they're pulling away. What has to already be true for that to be the first interpretation your mind reaches? It is almost always something encoded much earlier, like the idea that your presence is provisional, or that closeness eventually surfaces a reason for people to leave. You are not looking for that belief to argue with it or dismantle it on the spot. You are looking for it because it is the actual operating map, and you can't update a map you've never seen. The third move is the projection check. When the trigger involves a specific person and a specific quality they carry that activates something in you, you have to sit with a hard question. Is there any version of this quality that exists in you? This isn't an accusation, it is just a real look at yourself. Sometimes the answer is no, the activation is proportional and the pattern is straightforward. But sometimes, especially when the reaction feels slightly too hot or too personal for what actually happened, the answer is more revealing. What you can't tolerate in them is often something you've been working very hard not to become, or something you haven't admitted you already are. That recognition doesn't dissolve the trigger immediately, but it changes what the trigger means, and that change matters. It stops being a statement about their deficiency and starts being information about something unintegrated that is still yours to handle. Everything we have talked about so far, from the chain and the detection to the narrative and the projection, represents the first activation. What makes this experience so specific to self-aware people is the second activation that follows right behind it. The trigger fires, and then your self-aware mind almost immediately processes that reaction as evidence of your own failure. You start telling yourself that you should know better because you have worked on this for years, and you have a whole vocabulary for this exact pattern. When you find yourself activated again, you decide the work hasn't taken, which leads to the belief that you are more broken than you originally thought. That story is almost always more damaging than the original trigger ever was. While the original activation might only last 5 minutes, the shame loop that follows can run for hours or even days. It pulls in more evidence with every pass and builds a case that feels airtight because you are using your own psychological language to prosecute yourself. This process reactivates your nervous system and generates a specific kind of exhaustion that only comes from using your own insight against yourself. This is the trap that is unique to people who have actually done the inner work. When you make awareness your primary metric of health, every trigger starts to feel like a failed exam that you are taking in real time. You are trying to pass this test while under physiological stress with a nervous system that is already mobilized for a fight. There is no version of that test that is fair, and it never produces any useful information for your growth. The trigger is not evidence that you haven't healed, but rather it is evidence that you have an old pattern that still fires under very specific conditions. Those two things are not the same claim at all. Healing does not mean the pattern stops existing forever, but it means you stop treating the activation as a final statement about who you are as a person. The trigger is just data, while the shame is an interpretation you are adding to data that never asked for it. Unlike the trigger itself, that interpretation is something you actually have a choice about in the moment. The alarm fires, but whether you treat that sound as a coordinate to guide you or a verdict to condemn you is entirely up to you. So what does this actually require from you? It does not require a daily practice, a special ritual, or a perfect commitment to never skipping the work. What it actually requires is a fixed sequence you can run after an activation happens, in whatever space you have, without needing an audience or needing to get it right every time. There are 4 moves to this process. First, you trace the chain backward to the specific signal that started the reaction, focusing on the exact moment the response tripped rather than the general situation. Second, you identify the narrative your mind produced. Third, you ask what belief that narrative required to be the first one your mind reached for. Finally, you run a projection check on the emotional charge underneath your critique. That is the entire structure, and while it won't produce a massive breakthrough every time, it isn't supposed to. The goal is to route the activation through a process that actually ends somewhere, rather than letting it cycle through the same old loop with better vocabulary attached to it. The reason most people don't have this isn't a lack of intelligence or commitment. It is because insight and processing are two completely different operations, and most psychology content only develops the first one while leaving the second unaddressed. You get better at recognizing patterns and faster at naming them, but the loop just gets more sophisticated without ever actually closing. Recognition without processing is just rumination wearing a more educated coat. The loop is still a loop, and it still doesn't move you forward. What breaks the cycle is structure, which means a sequence with a defined endpoint rather than a conversation with yourself that runs indefinitely because every answer generates 3 more questions. The pattern becomes workable when you treat it as a structure with identifiable links instead of a verdict with a fixed conclusion. The trigger points, the chain runs, and the narrative forms, but then you read that narrative for what it embedded and check the projection. You arrive somewhere specific, and that is the difference between awareness that produces exhaustion and awareness that actually changes your life. You aren't getting triggered because you failed to work hard enough on yourself, but because the system detecting old patterns moves faster than the one narrating them. Nobody ever told you those were 2 separate systems, so you feel stuck when the trigger hits. Think of that reaction as a coordinate rather than a failure. Your real job isn't to silence the detection system, but to finally read what it's pointing at.